Hello and welcome to my first ever coverage of a deck tech featuring a commander that the first things that came to mind for some really good cards for this commander all of a sudden turned it into a deck itself. And yeah, so without further ado, let's just get right into it. The commander for this deck tech is Lurrus of the Dream Den. It is a legendary cat nightmare with 3 power and 2 toughness that costs 1 Orzhov. It has lifelink and says during each of your turns you may cast 1 permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. So, the goal of this deck is going to be mill. That's right, we're going to be using symmetrical and sometimes non-symmetrical milling effects to dig deeper into our deck and find cards that we can cast with Lurrus. And then by controlling the board and messing with people's hands, we're going to slowly grind them out until we mill our opponents or assemble one of our combos that will basically allow us to infinitely mill at our discretion. So without further ado, let's get right into the first of our 10 tactics. Huge shout out to Commander's Quarters for inspiring me to build this and managing to actually let me get there. First up, we've got our mana banks, our mana reserves, and as always, there's Wayfarer's Bauble. It is a 1-mana artifact that you can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card and put that on a card onto the battlefield tapped. Next up, we have our mana rocks that cost 2 and tap for both of our colors. We have Orzhov's Signet, and then we have Talisman of Hierarchy, which if we tap it for either of our colors, it'll deal 1 damage to us. Next up, we have the Draw Stones, starting with Mind Stone, which you get taps for a colorless, or we can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice it to draw a card. And this is good because if we sacrifice it to draw a card, we can still play it if we have an opportunity to with our commander. And then next up, we're running Hedron Archive because a lot of the cards and spells in our deck are also going to be costing 2 CMC or less, so any mana rocks that can tap for 2 are an automatic include in this deck. We can also pay 2 and tap and sacrifice Hedron Archive to draw 2 cards if the situation calls for it. Next up, we have Worn Power Stone and Firemind Vessel, both of which come into play tapped, but tap for 2, and in the case of Firemind Vessel, taps for both of our colors, which we can use to cast almost all of the cards in our deck. And then finally, we have 2 creature-based ramp, starting with Millikin. It is a 0/1 construct that costs 2, and you can tap and put the top card of your library into your graveyard, add colors to your mana pool. So this can also provide us ramp and give us card selection by putting the top card of our library into our graveyard in case we can cast it with our commander. And then Priest of the Forgotten Gods is a 1/2 human cleric that costs 1 and a black. We can tap, sacrifice 2 other creatures we control, and then target any number of players so that they all lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. This is a very strong way to control the board, and then after that's all said and done, we add black to our mana pool and draw a card. So now let's move on to our next tactic, which is how we're going to be using all of this mana, and that's Miller time. So first up, we have Returned Reveler. It is a 1/3 zombie satyr that costs 1 and a black, and it says when Returned Reveler dies, each player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Next up, we have Stitcher Supplier, which is a zombie 1/1 that costs a black. When Stitcher Supplier enters the battlefield or dies, we put the top card of our 3 cards of our library into our graveyard. So this is a great way for us to get some gas and play to our sacrifice outlets so that we can find cards that we need and use them to our advantage. Next up, we have Altar of the Brood, which is a artifact that costs 1. It says whenever another permanent we control enters the battlefield, each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into his or graveyard. So over the course of a battle, whenever we're putting cards onto the field or sending them away, we're going to be finding opportunities to mill our opponents and keep disrupting their hands and their decks. And then next up we have potentially the golden pig of the deck, and that's Altar of Dementia. It's a 2-mana artifact that has sacrifice a creature. Target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. So we can use this to sacrifice all of our creatures and either find more cards for us to use and cast with Lurrus, or eventually, part of our combo, sacrifice an infinite amount of times to mill at our opponents. But next up we have some other milling effects that come with virtually no downside. We have first up Ghoul Caller's Bell, which is a 1-mana artifact that you can tap, and each player puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So with this, we'll be able to find more cards for our deck while also milling our opponents. And then next up we have Codex Treasure, which is a 1-mana artifact that we can tap and choose a player, and they will put the top card of his or her library into their graveyard. And then, additionally, if we want to, we can pay 5, tap and sacrifice Codex Shredder, and return any card from our graveyard to our hand. So this is just a little bit of extra insurance for some of the cards that Lurrus cannot cast. And then once we've bought it back for 5 mana, we can just recast Codex Shredder. And then next up we have Mindcrank, which is another card that combos off really well with our Secret Commander. We'll be getting into him later. But it's a 2-mana artifact that says whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So with all of our opponents, if they're going to be swinging at each other or being dissuaded from attacking us, we'll be able to use this to add a little bit of extra milling into the equation, and yeah. And then next up we have 2 cards that are basically the same thing. We have Undercity Informer. It's a 2/3 human rogue that costs 2 and a black. You can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature. We choose a target player, and they reveal cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, and then they put all the cards revealed this way into their graveyard. And then Trepidation Blade does the same thing, but it triggers on attack. It's a 3-mana equipment that costs 2 to equip. And in addition to that, all the cards that are revealed this way give +1/+0 to our creature in the attack step. And then finally, almost finally, we have our creatures that are combat-centric as far as milling, and that's starting off with Eye Collector. It's a 1/1 fairy that costs black. It has flying and says whenever Eye Collector deals combat to a player, each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. And then there's Mindwrack Harpy, which is an enchantment creature harpy that has 3 power and 2 toughness, that costs 3 and a black. It has flying and says at the beginning of combat on our turn, each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this is going to be milling all of our opponents for a lot, and also continuing to allow us to see more cards for us to mill. And then finally, we have Dread Summons. It is a sorcery that costs X black. Each player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. For each creature card put into a graveyard this way, we will generate a 2/2 black zombie token that enters the battlefield tapped. So this is a great way for us to sink all of our mana and then create a bunch of tokens that we can either use to deal damage or sacrifice to our altar to add even more milling potential, effectively tripling the amount of mill in a lot of circumstances, but for the most part doubling the amount of mill that is done from the amount of creatures that are sent to the graveyard by the Dread Summons. And so next up, we're going to be having some interaction with our opponents, because we can't just sit around milling about. We have to also hurt their resources. So our next strategy involves Burning Hands. First up, there's Vicious Rumor. It's a sorcery that costs a black. It says Vicious Rumor deals 1 damage to each opponent. Each opponent discards a card and then puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. You gain 1 life. And then next up, we have some discard that is on creatures. First up, there's Burglar Rat, which is a 1/1 rat that costs 1 and a black. It says when Burglar Rat enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. And then there's Miasmic Mummy, which is a 2/2 zombie jackal that costs 1 and a black, and it makes every player discard a card when it enters the battlefield. And then there's Yerak's Fenlurker, which is a 1/1 horror that costs black, except when Yerak Fenlurker enters the battlefield, each opponent exiles a card from their hand. And in addition to that, we can pay 2 and a black and give it +1/+1 until end of turn. And then to add to the discard hate, we're also going to be throwing in some draw hate in our 3/1 enchantment spirit that costs 1 and a white. It's Spirit of the Labyrinth, and it says each player can't draw more than 1 card each turn. So this in particular combos off really well with our other discard spell, and that is Dark Deal. There's a sorcery that costs 2 and a black and says each player discards all the cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards -1. So we don't care about discarding our hand, since as long as we have our commander, we are able to cast any cards that cost 2 or less from our graveyard. So this is going to affect our opponents a lot more than it's going to affect us. And if we have Spirit of the Labyrinth in play, everyone is effectively going to discard their hand and draw 1. And if we manage to get both down at the same time, we cast Spirit of the Labyrinth, our opponents are likely to cast some of their draw spells to get the advantage while they have the Spirit of the Labyrinth on the stack, and if that's the case, once Dark Deal is cast, they actually will be discarding their hands entirely. So, with all of that said and done, what are we going to abuse from the graveyard? So we're going to look at our graveyard effects that we care about in this tactic. Fine for me. First up, there's Pit Keeper. It is a 2/1 human wizard that costs 1 and a black and says when Pit Keeper enters the battlefield, if you have 4 more creature cards in your graveyard, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a card that we can cast with Lurrus and then effectively buy back any creature from our graveyard, getting us effectively a 2-for-1 in effects that can combo off with all of our sacrifice outlets and other certain effects, as long as we meet that threshold requirement. Next up, we have Salvage Scout. It is a 1/1 human scout that costs a white. We can pay a white and sacrifice it to return any artifact from our graveyard to our hand. So this is a good effect to just get us certain artifacts per turn. If we want to get more cards out of our graveyard, this is something that can allow us to fetch anything that might be out of our Lurrus's converted mana cost of 2 or less. Next up, we have some land recursion in Grim Discovery. It is a sorcery that costs 1 and a black. It says choose one or both, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or return target land card from your graveyard to your hand. So this can ensure that we hit our land drops if we're accidentally milling them. And Lodestone Bauble kind of does the same thing. It's a 0-mana artifact that we can cast, pay 1, tap, and sacrifice to put up to 4 basic lands from target player's graveyard on top of their library in any order. And then that player draws a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So for 1 mana, we can effectively either get an extra draw or actually draw our land for turn. So this is a great way to ensure that we get a little bit of value from our cards, and because it's a sacrifice effect, we can always recur it with Lurrus for 0 mana. And then next up, we have a very strong ramp card in the form of Planar Birth. It's a sorcery that costs 1 and a white and says, put all basic lands from all graveyards into play under their owner's control tapped. So, as early as turn 2, we can effectively ramp for 3 mana with Stitcher's Supplier into Planar Birth if we mill 3 cards from the first time. And if we actually manage to sacrifice that creature or put it in front of a 1/1 haster, or something like that, we can even potentially go up to 6 lands. This is a good card early and a good card late, depending on how many cards get milled, and it's very powerful. It's white-based land ramp, which can never be that bad. And then next up we have Seven's Reclamation. It's a sorcery that costs 2 and a white and says return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy this spell and may choose a new target for the copy. So this can allow us to either grab lands or grab permanents that are 3 CMC or less from our graveyard and put them onto the battlefield, which kind of effectively increases the amount of graveyard recursion we're playing per turn, and it has flashback for 4 and a white, which is very good for us in case we accidentally mill it. And then next up is another card that mills ourselves, but also provides a little bit of protection. It is Perpetual Timepiece. It is a 2-mana artifact that says tap, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then we can pay 2 and exile it, shuffle any number of target cards from our graveyard into our library. So this is a great way for us to keep digging and look for other cards that we want to add to our casting options for Lurrus, and protects us if anyone tries to put any exiling graveyard effects. Speaking of exiling graveyard effects, we're going to be controlling our opponents by also having access to these effects in this next tactic, not for you. First up, there's Remorseful Cleric, which is a 2/1 Spirit Cleric that costs 1 and a white. It has flying and says, sacrifice Remorseful Cleric, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. And now Spellbomb does the same thing, but it's an artifact that costs 1. We can tap and sacrifice it to exile all cards from target player's library, and whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, we can pay a black and draw a card. And the next up is the strongest card of all of our effects, as far as recurable things go. It's Soul Guide Lantern. It's an artifact that costs 1 and says, when Soul Guide Lantern enters the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard, and then we can tap and sacrifice it to exile each opponent's graveyard. So this hits all of our opponents, which is important if we're going to be milling all of our opponents simultaneously. We want to make sure they don't have access to those resources. So this is the biggest hit for all of those things. And then if we're not in a situation where we need to exile a card, we can always pay 1, tap, and sacrifice it to draw a card. Next up is an instant, Kaya's Guile. Costs 1 white black, and it has choose 2. Each opponent sacrifices a creature, exile all cards from each opponent's graveyard, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying, or you gain 4 life, or we can pay the Entwine cost for an additional 3 and play all of these effects. Now most of the time we're only going to be needing to use those first 2 effects because it clears the board and removes all of our opponent's resources in the graveyard, but there are some cases where gaining the life or creating a creature token could be beneficial. And then finally, in regards to not letting our opponents do things in the graveyard, we have Yixla Jailer. It's a 2/1 zombie wizard that costs 1 and a black, and has cards in graveyards lose all abilities. Now, if you're in a playgroup that has the Titans that shuffle your graveyard when they enter the graveyard, such as Blightsteel Colossus, or Kozilek, or Ulamog, or even Progenitus, you have access to this card, which will prevent your opponents from shuffling their graveyard into their library. One of the downsides of this is if your opponents have a little bit of graveyard recursion, they can take advantage of discarding or shuffling or placing their big creatures into the graveyard, but in any case, this does turn off a lot of those effects, so we can make sure that we don't have people countering our mill strategy. Keep in mind, though, it will turn off effects like flashback, but usually that won't be that big of an issue. This is just an option for when we're really trying to finish off the game and we have an opponent who is going to be a little bit difficult to pull that off in case they have those shufflers. So, how are we going to be controlling the board? That's going to be up in our next tactic, Blow them away. First up, there's Executioner's Capsule, which is a artifact that costs black. We can pay 1 and a black, tap, and sacrifice it to destroy target non-black creature. So, with all the recursion we have, we're going to be able to use it to make sure our opponents lose their non-black creatures, and then we can always just recast it and have that option available to us at instant speed. And then next up, there's Soul Snare, which is an enchantment that costs white. We can pay a white and sacrifice it to exile target creature that's attacking us, or a planeswalker we control. We can use this recurribly, thanks to it being a sacrifice effect, and make sure that people are very dissuaded from attacking us. If we're up against Voltron effects or just really big heavy creatures, we can get rid of them. And if we're in a circumstance where there's too many creatures, we can always make a different decision by casting some Wraths. But before we get into those Wraths, we also have some recurable enchantment and artifact hate. First up is Seal of Cleansing. It's an enchantment that costs 1 and a white and says sacrifice Seal of Cleansing, destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then Kami of Ancient Law is pretty much the same thing, except it can't target artifacts. It's a 2/2 spirit that costs 1 and a white and says sacrifice Kami of Ancient Law, destroy target enchantment. So with all the recurable enchantment and artifact removal, we can always make sure that our opponents aren't getting too ahead of themselves or using some cards that are just a little bit difficult to deal with. So next up in the world of artifact hate, we have Kataki, War's Wage. It's a legendary 2/1 spirit that costs 1 and a white and says all artifacts have at the beginning of your upkeep sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 1. So even though we are running a little bit of artifacts in this deck, we really don't mind if they end up in the graveyard as a result of the tax effect, and this will basically turn off our opponent's treasure tokens, food tokens, and a lot of other really pesky mana rocks and so forth. And they're going to be set back by having to pay their taxes or lose their mana rocks, and we will be set back if we have certain artifacts in play, or we can just play them, pay the price, or recast them with Lurrus. And so next up in the area of board wipes, we have Cleansing Nova. It's a sorcery that costs 3 white and has choose 1, destroy all creatures, or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. And then next up there's Divine Reckoning, which is a sorcery that costs 2 white. Each player chooses a creature they control, destroy the rest. And it also comes with a flashback cost, which is important again if we mill it, for 5 and 2 white. And then another great sorcery spell removal in black is Extinction Event. It's a sorcery that costs 3 and a black and says choose odd or even, exile each creature with converted mana cost of the chosen value. So in general we can use this to exile all tokens, which are 0, and choose even. And we can also, just depending on the circumstances, if it's available to us, we can just exile cards that are the most important thing to exile, which gets around hexproof and indestructible effects. And then lastly, not quite lastly, at least in the terms of board wipe potential, we have Ratchet Bomb. It's an artifact that costs 2 and says tap, put a charge counter on Ratchet Bomb, or we can tap and sacrifice it, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Ratchet Bomb. So, at its worst, it's a 2 mana, destroy all tokens. And if we need to build it up, we can take some time and pump it up with our charge counters until we get to the desired charge counter amount to destroy those converted mana cost cards. And then next we're running Magus of the Balance. This is a 2/2 human wizard that costs 1 and a white. It has pay 4 and a white, tap and sacrifice Magus of the Balance. Each player chooses a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifice the rest. Players discard cards and sacrifice creatures the same way. So this can act as a board wipe, a mana equalizer, and can even discard all of our opponent's cards if we've discarded our hand or played out all of our cheap CMC cards. So this is a great way to control the board and all the players, and then if we need to, if we happen to have more lands than our opponents, or vice versa, we always have access to our ramp cards to pull cards from our graveyard and put them back onto the battlefield. And then finally, we're running a Vampire Hexmage. It's a 2/1 Vampire Shaman that costs black. It has First Strike and Sacrifice Vampire Hexmage. Remove all counters from target permanent. So this is a great way to remove all of our opponent's Planeswalkers, or potentially deal with pesky artifacts or enchantments that like or care about getting charges or counters. And so how are we going to protect our own stuff with this? We're going to follow our next tactic, buckle them down. First up, there's Angelic Renewal, which is an enchantment that costs 1 and a white and says, if any creatures are put into your graveyard from play, you may bury Angelic Renewal and put one of those creatures into play. So this is a great way to recur our commander if we destroy all creatures, and then when the time comes, when we untap, we can basically just cast it again with Lurrus. So this is a really nice way to keep our Lurrus, our commander, alive, or depending on our other creatures that are in play, we can make sure those creatures stay alive. And then next up we have Benevolent Bodyguard. It is a 1/1 human cleric that costs a white and has Sacrifice Benevolent Bodyguard. Target creature you can control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. And then next up we have Dauntless Bodyguard, which is a 2/1 human knight that costs a white and says, as Dauntless Bodyguard enters the battlefield, choose another creature you control, and then when we sacrifice Dauntless Bodyguard, the chosen creature gains indestructible until end of turn. So we can use this effect, either of these effects, to basically give our commander protection from whatever target removal there is, or from board wipes. So with all of these things and all of the graveyard hate that's going into us, we're going to have to definitely pay close attention to our graveyard and play goalie, for example. So in our next tactic, Rescue, we cover some ways that we can make sure our graveyard does not get too out of control. First up, there's Elixir of Immortality, which costs an artifact that costs 1. We can pay 2 and tap it, gain 5 life, and shuffle Elixir of Immortality and our graveyard into our library. And then next up we have Feldon's Cave, which is a 1-mana artifact that has tap, exile, Feldon's Cane, shuffle your graveyard into your library. And then finally we're running one card to help us deal with cards that get exiled in case that ever occurs, and that's Pull from Eternity. It's an instant that costs a white and says put target face-up card that's removed from the game into its owner's graveyard. There are also some circumstances where we can just use this to interact with opponents' cards that happen to be in exile, whether they're suspended with time counters or there's some kind of shenanigans going on where by pulling them from the exile into the graveyard we can prevent them from being reused. And then finally, in tactic number 9, we're going to be going into our semi-combo, but also just some general creatures that provide us some sack fodder, and that's in our next tactic, Fuel the Flood. First up, there's the Lazotep Reaver. It's a 1/2 zombie beast that costs 1 and a black and says, when Lazotep Reaver enters the battlefield, amass 1. So when we amass, we're going to be creating an extra creature token, which will allow us to provide free sack outlets to our Priest of Forgotten Gods, or in general, just create sack fodder for our other milling effects. And so next up is our infinite combo that involves persist creatures. First up, there's Lesser Manticore, which is a 2/2 Masticore artifact that costs 2. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card. We can pay 4 mana. Lesser Manticore deals 1 damage to target creature, but it comes with Persist. And then we have Putrid Goblin, which is a 2/2 zombie goblin that costs 1 and a black and has Persist. And these all combo really well with Vizier of Remedies. Vizier of Remedies is a 2/1 human cleric that costs 1 and a white and has, if one or more -1/-1 counters will be put on a creature you control, that many -1/-1 counters -1 are put on it instead. So in this instance, we can infinitely sack and replay our persist creatures until our opponents are completely milled out. Or in other circumstances, we can have our Altar of the Brood go infinite with all the ETBs that happen. Or with our secret commander of the deck, Sir Conrad. Sir Conrad the Grim has, whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and we can pay 1 and a black, and each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So this combos off with all the ETBs and death triggers from our creatures with Persist, or in general just when things get milled, and also kind of combos off with Mindcrank. Mindcrank is a artifact that whenever our opponents take damage, they will mill the top card of the library, and as long as 1 creature is revealed each time this happens, Sir Conrad is going to continually deal 1 damage to our opponents, which procs Mindcrank. So as long as we can find the line just by circumstance where Sir Conrad and Mindcrank can deal a lot of damage to our opponents, we'll be able to mill our opponents as far as it will take us. And so how are we going to get out to these cards? We'll find that out in our final tactic, Finders Keepers. We're going to be running 2 tutors in this deck. First one is Diabolic Tutor, which is a sorcery that costs 2 black and says search your library for a card and put that card into your hand, then shuffle your library. And then probably our best tutor is Final Parting. It's a sorcery that costs 3 black. Search your library for 2 cards, put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So in general, we can tutor up for 2 of our pieces, whether it's our Altar of Dementia, a Persist creature, or Vizier of Remedies, or we can just tutor up Sir Conrad to our hand and put Mindcrank into the graveyard, and then with Lurrus, cast Mindcrank from our graveyard and then Sir Conrad. So with all this said and done, our mana base is going to be 21 swamps and 15 plains. I decided to go with only basic lands because that's kind of important to our Lodestone Bauble and our Planar Birth with all the amount of lands we're going to be putting into our graveyard. So with this in effect, we're basically going to be staying on top of everything and having the right amount of mana to cast most of our cards anyway, since the only really hard cards to cast for our deck are the black creatures. But for the most part, everything else costs 2 CMC and only requires 1 color. So if you're in the position to splurge your budget a little bit, or if you have access to these next upgrades, let's go into those right away. First up, there's Bloodchief Ascension. It's an enchantment that costs a black and says, at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Bloodchief Ascension. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. So with this, you can play this out, wait until 3 quest counters are put on it, and then it goes infinite with Mindcrank. Mindcrank makes the opponents mill their cards when they take damage, and then once they take damage from Blood Ascension, because a card went to the graveyard, they will take damage, which then mills them again, and that gains us basically infinite life and deals infinite damage. The stack will be a little complicated, but if you got the budget for it, this is a great upgrade and should be put in place of Sir Conrad. Next up, we have another card that kind of goes really well with our Spirit of the Labyrinth. It's Anvil of Bogarden. It's an artifact that costs 2 and says each player has no maximum hand size, and during each player's draw phase, that player draws an additional card and then chooses and discards that card. So if we can get our opponents to lose all of the cards in their hands and have this and Spirit of the Labyrinth in play, we will effectively lock our opponents out of the game, because as soon as they draw a card, they have to discard it. And if we can make sure that they have no resources, if we manage to board wipe at the right time and make our opponents discard their hands from all of our ETBs, we will definitely be able to pull off some really strong stuff with this card. So it's kind of an extra stacks piece that helps our opponents and ourselves dig deeper into our decks. And it's not a symmetrical effect, because as long as we have our commander in play, we'll be able to just cast our commander and play whatever card we discarded. And then next up, we have a recurable board wipe in Planar Collapse, an enchantment that costs 1 and a white and says, during your upkeep, if there are 4 more creatures in play, sacrifice Planar Collapse and destroy all creatures. Those creatures cannot be regenerated this turn. So this will sometimes destroy our commander or everyone else's board. It's situational because it's during our upkeep, but the fact that it's a recurable enchantment with Lurrus makes it just a little bit more interesting for us. Especially if we can find ways to make our commander indestructible, or if we have the opportunity to recast our commander when the time is right, we can play that and then play Planar Collapse again and just continue to have access to it. This also works really well with Angelic Renewal with our commander in play, so that once we've board wiped, destroyed all creatures that can't be regenerated, we have 2 mana available to us to then, once again, recast this card. So just a recurable board wipe that can go in place of potentially Divine Reckoning, but that's hard to say. And then next up we have Serenity, which is a board wipe for artifacts and enchantments. This would be played in place of Cleansing Nova if you're in a play group potentially that doesn't have as many creatures to abuse. It's an enchantment that costs 1 and a white and says, at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy all artifacts and enchantments that can't be regenerated. So this is a really good way to just make sure your opponents can't really play anything, because as soon as your upkeep comes and then it's destroyed with all the other enchantments and artifacts that are in play, you can then just recast it with Lurrus, and then your opponents will pretty much be relented to only casting creatures. And depending on your circumstances, with something like Priest of the Forgotten Gods, you can just make sure that your opponents pretty much don't have access to any resources. So if you were to use this, I would assume it would probably be best to be placed in place of Cleansing Nova, but again, it's kind of a hard judgment call. There's so many cards in this deck that have a lot of recurable value, so make those decisions yourself. And the next up, we have a targeted removal in an aura enchantment called Soul Tithe. It costs 1 and a white and says, enchant an online permanent. At the beginning of the upkeep of enchanted permanent's controller, that player sacrifices it unless he or she pays X, where X is its converted mana cost. So we can use this to basically force our opponents to sacrifice something big that they might have cheated into play, such as an Omniscience or a Blightsteel Colossus, or any number of other permanents where if they don't have the mana for it, or if we manage to destroy their mana rocks, we can play Soul Tithe, and then they won't be able to pay the cost, and then they'll have to sacrifice it. And then whenever it's sacrificed, or when the permanent itself is removed from the game, we can then recast Soul Tithe as our targeted removal. You can probably use this in place of Executioner's Capsule, but in general, I think this would probably take the place of maybe Kami of Ancient Law. And then next up is a nice little draw engine that comes with a little bit of extra information. It's Mistress Bauble. It's an artifact that costs 0 and says tap, sacrifice Mistress Bauble, look at the top card of target player's library, draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So this is just a nice way to get around the Spirit of the Labyrinth draw stipulation, draw clause by drawing cards when you sacrifice it, and then finding opportunities to tap and sacrifice it to keep an eye on your opponent's cards, while also maybe potentially deciding if you wanted to mill that card, because it goes well with either Ghoul Caller's Bell or Codex Shredder, to make sure that if it's a card that your opponent's going to want, you can just mill them for 1. And the next up is a card that kind of depends mostly on your meta, and most of the rest of these cards are just things that are situational but have a place in this deck potentially. First up, there's Dark Sphere. It's an artifact that costs 0 and has tap, sacrifice Dark Sphere, prevent half of the damage done to you by a single source rounded down. So if you've got a meta where people play big splashy burn spells or big creatures, this is a great way to make sure that you don't take as much damage from those resources, and it really slows down your opponents. It's recurable with Lurrus, as noted by its low CMC and only being a sacrifice clause. But yeah, this is a card that definitely has a place if you've got certain kinds of decks you're playing up against. And the next up, we have a Reanimator spell that's just pretty good because of the Threshold effect. It's a sorcery that costs black called Stitch Together. It says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or if you meet the threshold, which is 7 more cards in your graveyard, you return that card to the graveyard from the graveyard to the battlefield immediately. So this will be pretty much a way to just bring creatures back. We don't have a lot of big, expensive, or big creatures that we use or abuse from the graveyard or reanimate. But just because it has that threshold clause, that's the main reason why I included this in the alternative things for you to consider for your deck. And the next up is an egg in the form of Sabo's Web. It's an artifact that costs 2, and when it comes into play, we draw a card. And then it says lands with an activated ability that don't produce mana don't untap during their controller's untap steps. This is a great stacks piece to make sure our opponents who have castles in play or any other special effects or abilities or legendary lands from the Kamigawa cycle, pretty much all of those cards are going to be turned off by this card, so it's just a nice little stacks piece, depending on what kind of stacks or hate bears you enjoy or need for your type of meta. And then, sort of awkward is Tormod's Crypt. It's the same thing as Remorseful Cleric, but the reason we run Remorseful Cleric instead of this 0 mana artifact is there are some circumstances where we're probably not going to be recurring this card, even though it is mana-wise a little bit more effective than our opponents care about. One of the big trade-offs is the fact that we have to tap it, so if our opponents have their own stacks pieces like Blind Obedience, we're going to not be able to abuse Tormod's Crypt. And then another thing is, once we have Remorseful Cleric, if we've exiled all of our opponent's graveyards and we have nothing else to recur with Lurrus, we can always cast Remorseful Cleric as a creature to use as our sack fodder. So that's the main reason why I have Remorseful Cleric instead of Tormod's Crypt. But again, depending on your playgroup or just in general what you like to do mana-wise, those two can be interchanged as needed. And then lastly, this is a card that doesn't really have a place in this deck, but was just something to consider. It's Lens of Clarity. It's an artifact that costs 1 and has you may look at the top card of your library and at face-down creatures you don't control. So you can use this to make sure that you don't accidentally mill cards that you actually care about. There could be circumstances where that does make a difference if there's a card that you can't cast with Lurrus, or if your commander has been removed. This is just a nice little value engine if you're playing in a lower tier, lower power range of decks. This can just kind of be a value engine, not necessarily an engine, but just a value card for all of the mill effects that you're going to be looking into in case you need to hit your land drop for the turn, or if you're trying to dig for a land drop, you can use that to your advantage. And so that's everything that has to be done with our rundown of Lurrus, the Dream Den mill deck. I had a lot of fun building this, and the final budget was a clean $47.94. Last time I looked at the prices on TCG Player. That, of course, is using heavily played cards and cards that just, very, very cheap because they've been heavily played, because those cards, as Mitch says, deserve a home too. So, huge shout out to the Command Quarters for all of its good and interactive content, and really inspiring me to look into Lurrus of the Dream Den for a budget deck. I was really excited building this, and I'm honestly pretty excited for where it's at as far as control-y things go for an Orzhov type deck that, with no blue cards, has some pretty interesting ways to basically mill all of our opponents. So I hope you enjoy this, and as Mitch says, have a good one.